Welcome to American Shoulder and Elbow Surgeons Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Chalmers, a shoulder and elbow surgeon at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Brian Waterman, a sports and shoulder surgeon at Wake Forest in North Carolina. Brian, how are you?
Hey, doing great, Peter. How are you?
I'm doing great. Before we get started, I should mention the views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of the American Shoulder and Elbow Surgeons Society, the University of Utah, Wake Forest University, Atrium Health, or the institution of any of our guests. Okay, so today we're very excited to welcome Dr. Michael Pearl on the podcast. Michael Pearl is a shoulder and elbow surgeon at Kaiser in Los Angeles. He came to Los Angeles after training at Columbia with Matson and the University of Washington, and has been in practice in Los Angeles now for many decades. And he's been a perennial fixture at the ASES annual meeting and has made just a huge number of contributions to understanding of the shoulder. Dr. Pearl, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. If I can correct you, I just changed my location of work. So after decades at Kaiser, I'm now at Cedars-Sinai across town, and have the good fortune of being named Chief of the Shoulder Service there.
Well, congratulations. I didn't know that, but that's amazing. Well deserved.
So that's my new job in retirement. So
Congratulations.
Doesn't sound like retirement. Yeah, you are failing retirement, but I'm excited for you. So we're very excited to have you as a guest. We've had a few recent guests to talk about implant design and shoulder arthroplasty. We had Dr. Sean Churchill, who talked about the development of stemless anatomic. We recently had Anders Eklund talk about the development of the reverse with Paul Gramont. And I know you've played an important part in this role as well. And I want you to take me back in history. So you did a year of fellowship with Matson. What did shoulder arthroplasty look like for you during that year?
So it was 1991, 1992, pardon me. There was only a couple of fellowships in existence. You either trained at Columbia or with Charlie Rockwood. And shoulder arthroplasty didn't work for everybody. So there was kind of this myth that you had to train with one of the masters in order to know how to do it. And words like soft tissue balance, you had to know how to balance the soft tissues in order to make it work. And it was kind of a magic box, and no one knew the secret ingredients. So only if you did one of these training programs did you come out feeling like you were worthy of doing a shoulder replacement. But in the time I was training with Matson, they were extremely productive those years. Doug Harriman, Rick Matson, and John Seidels, in bringing science to shoulder surgery. And they were, Doug Harriman wrote these monumental papers of looking at how the effect of soft tissue tension if you increase the head height and things like that, and they were impactful. So, but I left the fellowship going, okay, we want soft tissue balancing, but wouldn't it make sense if the articular surfaces had a certain geometry in order to make this soft tissue balancing happen? And they were starting to make some progress in that direction, but I left with these giant question marks in my head, and was fortunate enough to kind of stumble into a research project that I basically did in my garage to kind of figure out the normal geometry of the humerus to help answer those questions.
Okay, so you're leaving fellowship. You have some understanding that soft tissue tension matters, and you think maybe the anatomy that is the key. Tell us, like, what did you do then to figure out the proximal anatomy? Like, how did you become interested? How did you study it? What did that look like?
So, Doug, they had a great cadaver setup where they were tracking motion with a Polhemus, which was an electromagnetic tracking system, and they had it set up so they could do a lot of experiments and look at what really happened with motion. And he had a paper that was published in 1995, but I think he was working on the research while I was there, where they just increased the thickness of the articular surface by 5 millimeters and just saw the soft tissue get tight. And then you remember these words from those early papers: obligate translations and capsular constraint. Those were forces at play in the shoulder that they coined the terminology for, but they watched how that happened as they increased the volume of the humeral head. But they didn't really put it together completely, because they had an implant they had just designed, the Global Shoulder 1, which had all these different head sizes, and that almost now it doesn't make any sense. And so I got this idea of studying the anatomy you may find this amusing, but I did grand rounds at the local university, USC, and I made an announcement to the residents. If anybody wants to do research, here's my phone number. I put it up on a slide, and this one resident, Al Volk, called me, and I said, "Listen, let's go by the gross anatomy class at USC and ask when they're done with their gross anatomy class if we can have all the humeruses." And I don't know if we could do that today, but they said, yeah, sure, whatever. So when they were done with the gross anatomy for the med students, we collected the humeruses and then developed this jig, which really out of stuff I bought at Home Depot, some wood, and I used commercial reamers, and we created this jig that suspended the humerus around the reamers. So now you define geometry in relationship to the ream canal, which made sense to me because that's where the implant was going to go. So we want to see what the measurements of offset and inclination angle and all that stuff related to the ream canal. You need a reference point to start. So you can pick the center of the canal, which has been done by many other studies, and that's reasonable. But just for ease of measurement, since I didn't have 3D imaging at that point, I used the reamer, which gave me a nice axis. And I collected everything. I kind of did retroversion and then head height, offset, things that made sense to me in terms of trying to articulate what the geometry was. The one thing that I did, and this was uncharacteristically strategic and clever for me, was I published the retroversion data first because I knew that the coronal plane geometry data was going to be so inflammatory and controversial to thought leaders who all were designing implants that I wanted to get the methods in print so that they would be incontrovertible and say, okay, you accepted this paper already on the basis of the methods, so you can't discount the other paper on the basis of the methods. But otherwise, it really should have been published as one paper. And retroversion didn't seem to offend anybody, which in a way I thought it might, because the way I was taught in my fellowship from Dr. Masson, the way everyone was taught, is the way you make your head cut is you externally rotate the arm 40 degrees, and then you cut straight down to the floor, because that's how you put in humeral implants. And then we do this retroversion study and find that the range in my study was from 0 to 50 degrees. This enormous scatter. What does that mean when you impose a very specific inclination angle on any given anatomic person or specimen in this case? So that was already to me kind of enlightening and illuminating. And then all the other stuff with the anatomy being so variable, and it made it clear that we couldn't do a great job when we were going to the OR with one inclination angle, one plan for retroversion, et cetera, no matter how many head sizes we had. Because there was no variable offset either. So you had thin heads and thick heads, and then you had to try to make it work. A lot of overstuffing took place, and the rest is history, as you say. But I followed that up later with geometric analysis using data from the implants themselves, and I got all that data from the templates that were available, all the geometry of the implant systems. And that took a little bit of work to kind of measure that stuff. And I found a talented young programmer, an undergraduate at USC named Sam Kuritz, and we used the program Mathematica, which I was exposed to in my fellowship as well, to kind of do these optimization things where we try to take the implant geometry that's available and say, okay, if we meet certain criteria, how do we get the best fit? And I think I kind of came upon two different points that were important, and those have stood the test of time: how closely you can replicate the center of rotation, and then something I call the articulation point, which is really kind of the maximum point on the surface of the articular surface away from the center of rotation. And if you think, that's a very good proxy for soft tissue balance. And if you can match those two things, then you're doing a pretty good job in the way I understood the anatomy that I was trying to replicate. And that sort of sums up the kind of entry into the geometry. That the other interesting thing at that same time was when I was I was not successful at presenting the anatomic papers at an American meeting ever. I got one poster in, but nobody thought it was important. And my first oral presentation of it was in Europe at the international meeting in Helsinki in 1995, and I went in there. I had like 3 papers accepted, and it was all anatomy stuff and some other stuff I was working on with brachial plexus, and I go in there, and then I'm ready to tell the whole society that our implants do not fit. We really have a problem here. And then I see this back booth, a small implant from this company called Tournier that I didn't know anything about, that had this variable offset and variable inclination angle, but they had never published any of their data because for them it was like industry information. They didn't want to kind of release the secret sauce, if you will. So my stuff was the only stuff published on variable geometry at that point. But I had this kind of sinking feeling that like everybody in the room knows about this, but it turned out that they were just getting going too. So we became fast friends and compared notes, and it was a very exciting time because we were thinking the same things and developing it at the same time.
That's certainly a hell of a way to kick things off. Wow. I don't know I don't want to speak for Peter, but you seem to have accomplished a lot very early stage in your career. I can assure you no foundational research is occurring in my garage presently. Just to backtrack a minute, to talk about the variability, and let's just start with the version piece. I think so many of our trainees come out now and they just have this reflexive approach to cutting the humeral head in 20 to 30 degrees of retroversion. It's been so baked into our procedural process. But what you've described is kind of some fascinating tails end of the bell-shaped curve. Walk us through how you evaluate that. Is that something that you would currently assess on CT scan? How much of the reads are anatomic at the time of surgery? And any tips that you might have for getting it right in the presence of really deformed glenohumeral arthritis?
So I take a detour first, if I might, Brian, just in answering the question, because as we were all geared up to kind of design anatomic implants, and there were many of them coming out, all of a sudden this reverse comes out of Europe, and the recommendation when it first was released in our country and for the first 10 years of existence was to put them in 0 degrees of retroversion, and I kid you not that this was like that was the recommendation, like, which is hard to do when you if somebody comes in with 40 degrees of retroversion natively and you cut them so they have 0 degrees of retroversion, what you've done to the proximal humerus is complicated. And lesser tuberosity, you're just kind of stuffing this implant in there. The reason for that was the first people to get reverses didn't have posterior rotator cuffs, so they lived in internal rotation, and it kind of made sense. But then, as you know, now we're kind of moving into a more anatomic era of the reverse. So we're matching more the native anatomy, especially if you have posterior cuff. And I think a lot of the residents are learning that, with the reverse, you aim again for about 20, 30 degrees, whether it's for a fracture or for an anatomic replacement. So the pendulum swung back from absolutely individualizing retroversion to something that's more akin to what you do in what's now 80% of the cases, which is the reverse. But the reality is, if you're doing an anatomic replacement, you can't just go in with that 20 to 30 degree number. You really have to look at the individual that you're dealing with. And in answer to your question, sometimes the arthritis isn't so bad and you can kind of see the native anatomy. But I think one of the skills that evolved from all this thinking and literally sleeping with the humerus cadaver bone in my nightstand, right next to my bed, is that I can kind of see the native anatomy and peel away osteophytes till I get a real gestalt for what the 3-dimensionality of it is. I'm still a freehand cut person because I feel like I can see the osteotomy that I'm trying to make in my head, and I don't make it until I can see it that way. By the way, there was a guy named Joel Mata who was a very kind of well-known hip and pelvis surgeon in the Los Angeles area. You may have heard of him, but he was a pioneer in that area. But at some dinner somewhere, I heard a myth that he slept with the pelvis uh, by his bedside, and so I immediately did that with the humerus, and and it does give you a familiarity or intimacy with the bone, shall we say? Um,
Somehow it sounds a little bit more socially acceptable with the proximal humerus.
yeah, and yeah, it was easier to store too, but it was. Um, so, and I learned from our French colleagues too. I watched them early on as we were doing these things together, and how they moved towards, and that was probably Gilles mostly, who had kind of developed these techniques to kind of find the native anatomic neck. The original implant had 4 inclination angles, and uh, they seem to fit a bell curve from their data. So they developed this way of kind of looking at the humeral head. I think I was trained again to go kind of top down, so it would be anterior to posterior cut with in my fellowship, and again that was going to be with the arm externally rotated 40 degrees and at an inclination angle that was matching that of the implant, which was 45 degrees, or depending on how you measure it, 135 degrees, and that's the cut you made. When I watched Gilles operate, he was doing more of a bottom-up cut, so he was looking at the front and the back of the humerus, more external rotation, could get a better view of where that anatomic neck was or might have been, and then made the cut protecting the cuff going from bottom to top. That changed my orientation. I mean, there were many arthritic shoulders where you didn't really see the back when you did the osteotomy in the old way. You just kind of got like a dara behind there or something to protect the cuff, and then just cut right down on it. It's a different way of thinking. So good exposure, good inferior capsular release along the neck of the humerus, and I don't think I was doing as good a job as of that either until I kind of scrubbed with Gilles.
It's got so fascinating to hear you tell your story. I have so many follow-up questions. I mean, between doing the research in your garage and the subsequent things you say about the influence of version upon the rotators, that I think is probably one of the more interesting questions, and one that I certainly have heard debated. My understanding was that originally it was recommended to put the reverse in 0 degrees of version to get the patient more internal rotation. Was that your understanding? And if you do that, what does that do to the external rotators? Does that make them so they're tighter as you try and come in? Like, how does that affect the ability of the external rotators to actually rotate the humerus?
So I don't think it was ever explained to me in a satisfactory way why we put it in 0. And I found it offensive because I had just spent so much time studying and communicating that retroversion was so variable that just putting it in any one number was offensive. But 0, seriously, I did have a specimen that was 0, but only 1, and most studies actually have like 10, range from 10 to something. But the way I explained it to myself was that since they had no external rotation, they lived in internal rotation. So if you want them to be functional at all, they need an implant that puts their arm in a position where it can go, because that's where the muscles will take it. And so it wasn't that they got more internal rotation; they had no choice. They had no external rotators. So it certainly has a big impact if you do have external rotators, because you're going to limit your excursion, and you won't be able to enjoy the external rotation that you have from a motor point of view, because the joint will bottom out. You'll lose the excursion.
And then the next question I have for you is you mentioned that you were worried about publishing the coronal anatomy, and you were worried it was going to be inflammatory. And it sounds like part of that concern was about the subsequent follow-up paper to show that there really wasn't great fit between the existing implants and the anatomy. But was that the main concern? And if so, what was the response? Like, when you published that data, were there people calling you to tell you that you were wrong? Were the companies coming to you and saying we have to revise all of our implants? Like, how did the field respond to that?
So my hunch was borne out, and I had a lot of trouble getting the coronal plane paper through reviewers. The editor at the time was Rich Hawkins, and he wrote me a letter. We used to write personal letters back then at the end. And I just tell you that it read like this. Dear Michael, who I'd met him, I met him through my fellowship and things like that. And you don't get classier and more intelligent than Rich Hawkins. So I'm going to throw that out there. But nonetheless, this was the temperature in the room at that time. He goes, Dear Michael, I do not agree with your conclusions, but you have persevered through the peer review process. So we will publish your paper. And if you look, it's like the last paper in that particular journal of that issue. So I had a lot of trouble getting that one through the reviewers. And I had to answer all these queries about this because I didn't just present the data. I did give in my discussion the conclusion that the way we're doing the procedure now, we have to call a lot into question. And if you look, it's very generic pictures of like imposing a single inclination angle on anatomy of various forms. And it just made sense that if you're doing, let's say, a 45-degree cut on somebody who has very different inclination angle, you can only stick in so much prosthesis without distorting the anatomy. So that got into print. A couple of years later, when I had done the geometric analysis, that was quite interesting. That paper was nominated for the Near Award, and then I was told behind the scenes that it was like too commercial or something. I don't know, even though I didn't endorse anything. But it was, more to the point, it was accepted for publication, and then out of the blue, I got a letter from one of the editors saying that they've decided they can't publish my paper because it was based on proprietary data from the companies and therefore is not reproducible to others to verify its veracity. And it was really somebody saw that paper, and it really called into question specific implant designs because I used actual data from implants. I mean, if I might be so bold, the Biomet implant with a 35-degree inclination angle back then fared very poorly in the geometric analysis. And they were designed by prominent New York people that somehow got to somebody. But I wrote back a letter that I'm surprised was successful because it was like, not so fast. I took all this data from commercially available templates. There's no proprietary data here. Anybody can reproduce this if they go to the trouble, and I methodically told them how I did that. But that was kind of lucky because I think politics had come to bear, and that could be quite fickle. But I answered that query, I think forcefully, and then that one got into print. So I'm not normally a kind of inflammatory kind of person. It's just I think this came down to money, to be frank.
Well, it certainly is a transformational contribution to the literature, and not to be outdone, you've also taken almost a completely different interest in the influence of brachial plexus palsies on shoulder development. I'm just curious how you made that transition during your time in LA.
So, this is just being a curious person and paying attention to the world around you. And this came from working at Kaiser. When I was there and I was, trying to be an adult shoulder surgeon. I was interested in everything and mostly arthroplasty. But a plastic surgeon and the neurosurgery chief had started a clinic for kids with brachial plexus palsy to do microvascular reconstruction of the nerves in the neck when it was indicated. And Kaiser, takes care of 15 million people in the state of California. So that's like a small country. And there was a referral base set up for these paralyzed kids. The problem is you can only do that surgery within the first year of life, and they had inadvertently opened the floodgates to all these kids with shoulder problems. And that one was a plastic surgeon, the other one was a neurosurgeon. And they were looking around for anybody who would help. And so they were talking to the pediatric orthopedic surgeons in our group, who, they do scoliosis and club feet and a lot of hip dysplasia. They certainly didn't have a modern day understanding of how the shoulder works. And I was like wanting to know everything there is about the shoulder. I said I would gladly help. And I was just so confused. I read everything that was written about it and knew nothing about what the shoulder looked like. And then I realized nobody did. They didn't know what it looked like. And so every kid we took to surgery, I started doing arthrograms on, thinking that they were already asleep. And I could now start to visualize this cartilaginous anatomy. And then it became clear to me what the deformities look like, and could start to think about how to address the deforming forces. That was another advantage of being a shoulder surgeon, and so well trained by Dr. Mattson. Nobody had associated the internal rotation contracture with the deformity. But that was obvious to a shoulder surgeon, right? We knew that if you get bad internal rotation contractures, you have posteriorly directed forces that can, in an adult, turn into osteoarthritis and posterior wear. In a kid, I think it's more failure of development, but it's like a bounce effect on the posterior glenoid. But you had to know what the shape of the joint looked like in order to do that. And then as I was kind of thinking it through, we had all these elaborate operations where you were releasing everything to get down to the joint. Well, as a shoulder surgeon, why not go from the inside out? And that's what led to kind of the subscapularis tenotomy arthroscopically and things like that. But that's still a passion of mine, trying to help these kids and figure out what's going on. I spent 30 years at it, and I'm still confused. So.
Can I ask you about this? Because I think this is a very interesting area. I think for the same reason of you, and I just so admire your curiosity here. But I mean, you say here, internal rotation contracture contributes to retroversion. That's because that's the specific deformity we see in brachial plexus palsies. Well, the obstetrical brachial palsies. Do you think the same is true in arthritis? So do you think is it the contracture, the internal rotation contracture? Is it weakness of the external rotators? Is it muscular imbalance in both directions? Like, which of those things is the driving factor in the plexus patients? And then can we take an analogy from that into osteoarthritis?
I'm not sure we can, there's similar forces, but I'm not sure we can kind of learn from the plexus population things that relate to arthritis, other than when you tighten the front, there are posteriorly directed forces on the joint. It's interesting in the brachial plexus population, the thinking was always it's an imbalance. You must be, since it's a paralytic condition, your external rotators must be paralyzed and your internal rotators must be overpowering them, creating this dynamic imbalance. There's some element of that, but the newer data and out of like mice and rat studies, if you will, shows that the neurological injury to the subscapularis actually causes a failure of growth too. What I think actually happens is the upper fibers of the subscap, which have an upper plexus innervation, fail to develop in the longitudinal direction, and they get shorter, while you have the dynamic forces in the lower subscap, which are innervated by the lower plexus, that are still pulling. So you get the worst of both worlds, a dynamic imbalance plus a static tether pulling on the anterior tissues, and then in this growing joint that's trying to respond to the forces across it. And it just doesn't let the posterior glenoid develop, and then the thing gets pushed out the back and deformed, and then the humeral head develops abnormally as well. Just to be clear, as you said, retroversion, the glenoid has it's retroverted by any way we measure it, but it's really underdeveloped, and it's totally dysplastic. So it's not exactly like you take a normal shaped glenoid and retrovert it. It's something that's just posteriorly undeveloped. The humerus, on the other hand, I studied that not too long ago, actually becomes anteverted. the early literature, there's only like 2 papers on it, said that the humerus was retroverted as well, because it sort of looks that way. It's oblong and deformed, but it's actually anteverted compared to the opposite side. And not that that's relevant, but but the deformity is just kind of a mishmash of things. For the osteoarthritic, I think this is like this debate's going to go on for a while. You know, what makes the B2 glenoid? Is it posterior wear? Is it something they're born with? Is it the critical shoulder angle? You know, the whole scapular geometry? Is it just how their shoulders work? Is it some genetic predisposition? I don't know. I just know that there's posteriorly directed forces at a certain point overwhelm the ability of the bone to maintain its shape. And I'm sorry if I can't kind of shine a light on that any better than that.
I'm so disappointed. I was really hoping you were going to finally tell me the answer to the B2. We're going to have to hold for the next podcast for that one. Now, tell me, one of the things that I think is interesting here is you talk about how this is occurring during development. Do you think it's fixable? Like, for instance, there are people now doing an increasing number of large feces transfers in these patients. If you do that and you add more external rotation, if you do what you talk about with the subscapularis, does the glenoid start to develop more normally, or is it kind of what's done is done?
So going back to the kids, right? The brachial plexus.
Kids, yeah, exactly.
So the remodeling is profound. I mean, it's extraordinary. And if you get the humeral head centered on the glenoid, it will change shape. Actually, even overnight. And you do a 1.5-year-old, the cartilage is actually malleable, and so if you put the joint in a better position and you did an MRI instantaneously, you would see a different shaped joint. So that part's exciting. Now that malleability does not last forever, and by the time they're 6 or 8, it's a different structure. It still has a lot of growth potential and opportunity to remodel, but not to the same extent. Lower trapezius, it has actually been published. I think it was Philip Valente in Paris that did a couple in brachial plexus kids. I don't like the idea of using allograft in anybody, but kind of got used to it for adults with the lower trap, but not in a kid. And I don't think you need to. I think they, number one, just doing a release to get that external rotation back has, in my hands, has solved the problem 80% of the time. It's actually one of the confusing things in the field. If you read the literature of people that do a lot, almost all the people that do releases and muscle transfers do releases and muscle transfers at the same time. So we don't really know which was essential. But in my publication and in my experience, 80% of the time, a release effectively restored external rotation. They had sufficient external rotation power to maintain it. It was just overwhelmed by the contracture. So you don't necessarily need to put an external rotator in there. And if you do, in kids, the latissimus is still very effective.
So it's interesting. I mean, I think about this constellation of folks that have focal retroversion or posterior glenoid dysplasia, and inevitably some of them have posterior shoulder instability. It seems like they have this reactive posterior glenoblabrum hyperplasia. You know, in drawing analogies, how do you explain the development of this? What are the forces that lead to this relative containment when the bony foundation has failed?
Again, I think it's a separate entity, the glenoid dysplasia. I'd like to use the brachial plexus experience as a way of getting insight into it, but I haven't done a ton of glenoid dysplasia cases, but the ones I've done, it feels like a different thing. It's just it's not obviously or apparently neurologically based. I do. I think I know what you're talking about. I've seen these beefy labrums that it's almost like if you were doing an arthrogram, it would almost look like a normal, slightly retroverted glenoid, but half of it's just a big labrum, a big posterior labrum. I think that's what you're talking about.
Right, right.
And yeah, you don't see that in brachial plexus posterior dysplasia. The labrum is kind of, it almost goes away. And it's not a stout structure like you see in dysplasia. You may have more experience in treating dysplasia than I do, but there was a couple of cases I did where I really tried to preserve that labrum and do like a bone graft to just prop up the labrum, and that was quite satisfying. It really kind of contained the joint, and it made me feel better because I didn't have dead bone pushing against their humeral head. I had like their own native soft tissue.
I was more so trying to just buy more time so I could finish drawing out the brachial plexus and compose a thoughtful reply to your previous question. Hey, I did have an interest. It seems like you've accomplished so many of these amazing academic achievements outside the traditional, tertiary academic center framework. Can you tell us how you did that? Is there a coalition you established? Are you a one-man wrecking crew? Maybe talk to us about how you've accomplished so much.
I think, well, first of all, thank you for the recognition, which I think is overstated, but I think it came down to the curiosity and I didn't really set out to be an academic surgeon. I think that's one of the reasons I took the job that I did, because I like to do a lot of different things. At least I thought I did back then. But I just sort of was curious, and I followed my curiosity, and every little bit of insight I got, and every successful publication, I think it really got me going. I wanted to do the next thing, and so I was following my nose a little bit. I often wished I was in a more supportive environment, but I think one of the things that enabled any kind of success was I had questions, but I always picked questions that were within the realm of my ability to answer them with the tools available to me. So I was so I had anatomy questions, and I don't know. I had a glimmer of an insight into how I could measure these things with just plain X-ray and some bones that I got for free, and a realistic project that I could actually achieve. The arthrogram for these kids that are already going to under anesthesia, that was low-hanging fruit back then too. I had a little bit of a problem in that when I first started to do it, I didn't do the proper IRB type stuff because I didn't realize I was doing a research project. I was just trying to understand things so I could help the kids, but then it turned into a research project, and it's like, are you experimenting on kids here and stuff? So that was a real little bit of a wake-up call, and fortunately things were a little more lax back then, but I got the paperwork in order. And then I did some MRI studies in these kids too, and that was labor intensive because to do an MRI in a young child takes general anesthesia usually to get a quality study. So you have to get the cooperation of anesthesia, and in a place like Kaiser, there's no real incentive or money in it, so it's hard to get people to do things sometimes when it's not customary. And Peter Waters, who's another major, well, he's in your neck of the woods, Brian, but he's a major contributor to the field, and he was publishing an MRI study. So I thought, I got to do that too. So I actually did one cohort where I did both arthrograms and MRIs to see how they related to each other, and that was really very interesting. But I was at a meeting with Peter once, and I was like, we were just walking, from one place to another. I think we were going to the gym actually after a session, and I go, aren't these MRIs a pain in the ass? It's like, I order them, and then I get a ton of calls from the parents, and then calls from the techs, and then calls from the anesthesia. And he looks at me and goes, huh, really? I just order shoulder MRI, and it's on my desk the next day. And he looks at me and smiles. And so that's the difference of being, a big guy at Harvard versus what I was dealing with. So, and so sometimes more resources are helpful and more support.
Well, certainly, I think it makes what you've accomplished all the more important or impressive. One of the things you've been a very curious person, and when I went back and reread all your papers in preparation for this, I ran into a paper that you and I talked about probably about a decade ago about Codman's paradox. Now, I cannot believe that I'm admitting this, but we have gotten 130 episodes in the podcast, and we've not yet gotten to Codman's paradox. So I want you to do the honors. Tell our listeners, what is Codman's paradox? And then I want you to talk about your paper resolves it. How did you resolve it? And there's a particularly useful analogy in this regard in your paper about why the paradox exists.
So actually, my first interest was in shoulder motion and studying motion, and that's one of the reasons I actually decided to go into the shoulder, because it had so much motion, and I wanted to kind of learn better ways of talking about motion. But Codman, who we all know was such an amazing contributor and a leader in so many ways. But he wrote one book called The Shoulder. I think it was published in 1934. And he has a whole chapter on motion, and there's some really amusing things in it. It's like, he goes, why do we call flexion? And he shows a picture of a horse, like putting his arm in front or something, and says, well, we wouldn't call that flexion. But then he has Codman's paradox, which he has diagrammed out, and it basically goes like this. So I need you guys to kind of do what I say as I do it. All right. And I'm doing this from memory. So,
okay,
the Codman's
I'm ready.
paradox
Let's go.
You can prove that the completely elevated arm is in both internal and external rotation at the same time. And here's the proof. Raise your arm directly overhead, pointing to the ceiling. Bend your elbow 90 degrees so you can track the rotation. And now, without rotating your humerus, descend in the coronal plane until your arm is by the side. What position is your arm in? External rotation.
90 degrees external rotation, yeah.
Right. Okay. Go back to the same starting position, arm pointing straight up to the ceiling. Bend your elbow 90 degrees. Without rotating your arm, descend your arm in the sagittal plane until your arm rests on your abdomen. What position is your arm in?
90 degrees internal rotation. This is the paradox.
So you have just proved that the completely elevated arm is simultaneously in both internal and external rotation. So the paradoxes, after you explain them, go away, and they're no longer paradoxes. So this is all an artifact of how we talk about motion, and clinically we use these terms, internal, external rotation, and try to wrap our head around it. It's amazing how many people actually try to explain that. And it's in the literature. Whoever was T.B. Johnston was one guy. He wrote a paper on it and made no sense whatsoever. Something about the tuberosities banging into the acromion and things like that. But the reality is there is no paradox. Like if you give this problem to an engineer, they go, "What are you talking about?" It's well known that if you rotate in 3 dimensions around 2 different axes, you're going to wind up in 2 different finishing positions, even from the same starting point. So the analogy I used was like a boat on the globe, because we're really talking about spherical motion. So a boat on the globe, if you start at the North Pole and you go down along the longitude that would be the coronal plane, but you don't rotate the boat, you just take it from its starting position and just follow that path, you're going to have a boat that's in a very different position than if you go down what would be the sagittal plane, or 90 degrees longitude from that. And it was just to be a pictorial version of how rotating around 2 different axes from or following 2 different paths from the same starting position will take you into a different position. But it was a paradox for me too when I started to think about it. But then if you just take a step back and kind of use geometry or engineering principles, I mean, there's even other things where if you map out the surface arc and radians, so you can predict the actual final position, even for otter shaped rotations and things like that. But that there's another paper written by Bill Mallon, who is with all his major contributions to the journal and everything else, and happens to also be a brilliant mathematician, and he wrote a paper that I couldn't really even understand on tensors, and he sent it to me way ahead of publication just because he knew we were kindred spirits, and I just had to pretend like I was following along exactly what he was saying. But he's an amazing guy.
Yeah, I mean, I love the analogy because it's perfect. If you imagine, a boat or a plane that's headed directly north from Africa that goes to the North Pole, and another plane or boat that's heading from, Central America is headed to the North Pole, like those would be parallel to one another at the equator. But by the time they get to the North Pole, they're at 90-degree angles to one another. And that's like it's the exact same problem. It's such a brilliant analogy. So 10 years ago, you asked me what Codman's paradox was, and I didn't know, and now I know, which is great. And then you were like, you should read my paper, and I read your paper, and I was like, oh, this is great. So this is the thing that I love so much about shoulder surgery is there are so many hidden things like this. There's so many hidden complexities to our job that make it just like perennially fascinating.
Yeah. The one more word about spherical coordinates and things. When I started my fellowship, and one of the reasons I wanted to go to Seattle was I'd seen them present a paper that they did where they had drilled pins into each other's bones, scapular spine and the humerus, and then put these electromagnetic trackers on them. So they had data of like a range of motion exam and 8 volunteers of real range of motion data that was like built into the bone, and they were going to do more of this kind of stuff, and I wanted to get into it, so I started my fellowship, and they were so unsuccessful at getting the things published because they published them in like these long tables of XYZ coordinates with like Euler angles, and when I got to my fellowship, and I said to Dr. Mattson, I want to keep doing this kind of research, and he goes, well, we kind of moved away from that. It hasn't been so productive for us. So I go, well, do you mind if I kind of like just play around with the data? So he said, no problem. And so I started to look at the same data, and I came to him. It was actually between cases one day. I'd drawn on a globe like a pictorial version of the same data with things marked out as like surface coordinates and vectors on the globe, and I even used the forearm as like one of the vectors. And I said, what if we present the data like this? And that became the papers on describing motion, humeroscapular and humerothoracic, and the birth of the kind of the global coordinate system. And after I had that global coordinate system, well, if this communicates to clinicians so well, I'm going to put a boat on it and explain Codman's paradox. And so that was the whole sequence of that.
It's truly fascinating. It's great to go back and read these articles and take a deep dive. And I know this truly excites Peter. So thank you for taking a journey down memory lane. I want to play lip service to what the next chapter looks like for you now as chief of shoulder surgery at Cedars. What's the next challenge for Michael Pearl?
Well, as much as I've enjoyed academics, I never had residence, and I have residence for the first time and in the last year, and I've really been enjoying that. And looking at that is just a great thing for me to be doing now, and just like this conversation we're having now, I love the idea that I can give back some and share some stories and give some insight into things. So that's, I think, a big part of what I'm going to be doing now. I still want to keep studying these kids with the brachial plexus issues, and I have so many questions still in my own head. A little less gas in the tank for getting the answers. I think as a field, we need a reconciliation of what we know about normal anatomy and the variability of normal anatomy, and what we're doing to people's shoulders when we reconstruct them with a whole cadre of implants, which are now mostly reverse. So we need to kind of do a better job of figuring out what makes sense in different clinical scenarios. I mean, the buzzword of a more anatomic reverse is kind of amusing to me because it's something I've been talking about for a while, but just it's getting more traction. So figuring out things like that. And I actually just learned that my own organization in the building where my office is installing a motion analysis laboratory that was set up like a couple years ahead of time, but from an endowment. So this may be becoming back full circle to my interest in motion analysis. So,
well, I hope this will give you more opportunities to quiz your residents about Codman's paradox.
I do want to say that, like, when you were a resident, you wrote a paper on pitching mechanics.
Yeah.
And strangely enough, I mean, I appreciate all the congratulatory remarks you guys have given me, but these various web things that tell you when your paper's being cited or looked at, that I get a daily email for my contributions to your paper, which I didn't do very much on at all. So congratulations on that.
No, that was Dr. Romeo's idea, and it was invaluable. We really appreciated your help. Well, look, this has been phenomenal to have you as a guest. I really appreciate your time and you sharing your stories and your experience. And I'm hopeful that people listening to the podcast will find all of your contributions inspiring and follow their own curiosity to answer their own answer questions.
It's great what you guys are doing, and thank you so much for including me.
Amen to that. That's been a fantastic 45 minutes or an hour spent with you, and look forward to future chats. And we'll definitely try to have you back on so we can unpack the future of shoulder surgery.
I love that. I love that.
Perfect. Well, that's about all the time we have for this podcast. Thanks so much to our guests for their continued listening. For all our Shoulder and Elbow listeners out there, don't forget to subscribe. And for Peter Chalmers, I'm Brian Waterman. We'll see you next time. Thanks all.